First question, here we go. John Powell, you're being called to the front. You asked a great question. You said you gave a compelling account of heaven being an embodied place. How does this fit with the various scriptural admonishments to avoid the sins of the flesh? What is so wrong and so right about the flesh? And what might flesh becoming more itself look like? So John, you're asking about the sins of the flesh, and yet, Jim, in your book, you have a high view of the physical realm. So can you just talk about that a little bit?
Great. Yeah, thanks, John, for the question. Yeah, that's a very good question. It's obviously one which bothered a lot of Christians, and when people read the Bible, it's one that comes up when you read Paul's letters, for example, where he talks about the flesh or the world. And I think it's important that we understand that when Paul is using a term like the flesh or the world, he often uses that term, he doesn't mean physicality or the creation, but rather I think he's using philosophical terms that were and religious terms that were current at the time to mean something like the flesh and the world means something that you could approximate to the sin infected creation, or the flesh would be the sin infected kind of being, our sin infected being, something like that. So it would mean that part of the creation, or that part of ourselves which has turned away from God and is heading, I think as Luther called it, he called a human being incurvatus in se, which means man turned inwards upon himself, homo incurvatus in se, and so which is turned towards itself rather than towards the will of God. So the flesh and the world is meant in those terms. So it doesn't in any way mean that God is, anti the material creation, as Andrew Peterson said in the discussion just then. John 3:16, one of the most well-known verses in the Bible, is, for God so loved the world, and the word there is, his creation. So we've got to see that there's a difference. As I said, it's talking about the sin-infected creation, the sin-infected being, human being, rather than the material nature of creation itself, which, as I explain in the book, the Bible is very clear that God is redeeming his creation, not destroying it. Okay, over to, next question.
John,
thanks, John.
You happy with that, or is there anything you want to add? John's happy with that.
Okay, thanks, John.
Okay, we've got at least 8 questions. We may not get through all of these, but we'll just plow right along. Southborough Labrie asked a question about the rhythms of time. Southborough, whoever you are, do you want to come in and ask your question yourselves? I can also just read it. I'll read it and then unmute yourselves if you'd like to add anything. You wrote, the rhythms of time seem important to the biblical imagination, but the visions of the new creation at the end of Revelation speak of there being no more night and of the Lord being our light forever. What does this mean for our experience of time and the rhythms in the future? So this question is about imagining what it's really going to be like in the new creation, and trying to make sense of our experience here and the hints and imagery of the Bible. So Jim, did you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, well, you can trust my colleagues to ask a tricky question. Thanks, Southborough branch. But yeah, it actually reminds me, I think Paul talks about exactly this in Colossians, I think it's chapter 2, where he talks about people that are keen on celebrations, new moon celebrations and Sabbaths, etc., and these kind of rhythms. And then he says something which is fascinating, because he says, these are a shadow of the things to come. The reality, however, is Christ. And that's a fascinating kind of phrasing. And I think that's where, for example, Lewis took his idea of this world and the patterns and the rhythms of this world being a shadow of what is to come, and not the other way around. And one of our problems when we begin to imagine the new creation is we somehow, because we have these ideas of heaven being this ethereal place, and you know, less solid than this world. So we sort of imagine that somehow that, you know, there's less than the rhythms of this world in the new creation. But if you can somehow in your, you know, with your imagination, think actually there is more than the rhythms of this life. It is the rhythms of this life fulfilled and deepened, and that actually they point towards, you know, something bigger and deeper and more satisfying. And ultimately, as Paul says, you know, the reality is Christ is found in him. So a good example of that would be the Sabbath, for example. So the Sabbath day, the Jews celebrated as, you know, 1 day in 7, a day when they rested. And it was interesting because it is supposed to be a day, I think, which reminded them of what it was like to be in the Garden of Eden, and to be in trusting rest in the arms of their Heavenly Father. But when Jesus comes along in the New Testament, he says, come to me, all you who are weary, and I will give you rest. And the word that's used in the Greek there is actually the same word that is used in the Greek Old Testament for Sabbath. So Jesus is really saying, come to me and I will give you Sabbath. You know, the Sabbath isn't just for 1 day of the week. It is found in me at all times and all moments in every day of the week. So the Sabbath is something that points towards this greater fulfillment in Christ. And I think that's the way actually the whole of reality works. All these rhythms, they don't disappear in the new creation. They're fulfilled and deepened and given their true meaning. Okay, over to you,
Jim.
Andy.
Bjorn, do you want to ask your question next? I'll just put you up on the screen.
Hi, Bjorn.
Hi.
Good to see you.
Good to see you. Thank you for your for this book. Look forward to read it. My question is, how do we differentiate between and preach, not the least, and hold on to the tension between the physicality of the new earth and the fact that God himself will be present, who is pure spirit and loving and judging, and especially how we preach it, because so often it can be either kind of like a social gospel or just heaven or hell. And how do we keep both, hold on to both of those things?
Great, thank you. Thanks, Bjorn. Sonia, hello, good to see you too, Sonia. I think that one's got to be a little bit careful when you think about what it means for God to be spirit. This is something that I've thought about a lot, and if I ever get to write another book, it'll certainly be part of that. But I think a lot of the time when we think we think what the word spirit means, we imagine God's, when he says, you know, I am spirit, God is spirit, Jesus tells us, we imagine that Jesus is telling us that God is non-material or some, you know, ethereal, non-physical thing. But I don't think that's actually what God is describing, Jesus is describing there, because the word spirit in Hebrew and Greek means breathed out, you know, exhaled breath. And it is always connected with the idea of life. So I think what Jesus is telling us when he says God is spirit, he's not telling us God is some, you know, ethereal, non-material substance. What he's actually saying is something much more essential to who God is, and that God is breathed out life. He is the source of all life. You know, he is the great giver of life. That is his gift. And we see that in, you know, the first chapters of the Bible with the creation. So you know, and the way that God has given us life is to give us life within the dimensions of the physical creation. So he's put us within this, what we call the physical material world, and made us physical material beings, because that's exactly what he wants us to be, because he wants us to care for this world. And so there's no I don't see a tension in the Bible in that sense between, you know, spirit and material, because to be human is to be, or to be an unfallen human being is to be a spirit-filled physical being, you know, those two integrated together. And the spirit is, you know, it's God's spirit that gives us life. And, you know, it's that life that we cut ourselves off from when we cut ourselves off from God. And it's that life that Jesus has come to restore to us. So, yeah, I think we need to, rather than kind of see this, again, this division, you know, spirit material is actually this reality that God is, you know, bringing these realities together. That is always his plan, that this physical creation would be spirit filled. And that's what he will do, you know, in the new creation, the new heaven and the new earth come together. So that takes quite a bit of getting one's mind around. But anyway, I hope that's a little bit of an answer to that question.
Bjorn, do you have anything else you want to follow up on?
Well, just how will God be present then?
How will God be present?
That's the hard thing to wrap my mind around.
Well, I mean, God is present on earth. This is one of the things that I follow through in the book. How when we turn away from God, it's actually God who keeps on coming to be present on earth. And, you know, most religions, it's interesting, are about how can we reach up to God. But actually, the Jewish and the Christian faith is about God coming down to be with us. So it's constantly actually about God coming to be on earth. You know, in the interview, we talked a little bit about Jacob's ladder. You know, for God, it's not actually so we can go to heaven, but for God to be present on earth. And the tabernacle and the temple would be that. And obviously fully in Jesus Christ. But then the amazing thing that happens when Jesus goes to heaven is he sends his spirit to live within those people who trust in Jesus. So that if you are a Christian, you are a meeting place of heaven and earth. When the spirit fills you, you become a place where God is present on earth. And I think that's what Jesus says, isn't it? He says, where 2 or 3 are gathered together in my name, I am there also. You know, so actually that's, I think, yeah, that is how God is present on earth. One day when Jesus comes again, you know, that will be fulfilled, his presence on earth. But it is a present reality now in the lives of Christians and the church. Okay.
How's that
Thanks,
sit with
Bjorn.
you, Bjorn? Do you feel like your question's answered?
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Sorry, there's probably much more to say, Bjorn, but I'm trying to be fairly brief so I can get through a few questions. Yeah.
Thanks, Bjorn. Stefan, would you like to ask your question next? Stefan was asking, do you think that there's a meaningful way we can continue to talk about the soul without promoting dualism? How would you tackle that question,
Right.
Jim?
Yeah. Thanks, Stefan. Yeah. I definitely think there is a meaningful way we can talk about the soul. And in the book, indeed, I still, you know, talk about, I think this would be a traditional Christian way of phrasing it. And I think it's still very valid of saying, you know, when we die, our soul goes to be with Jesus in heaven. That's what he promises the thief on the cross, isn't it? He says, today you will be with me in paradise. So there is this idea of, yeah, definitely, I think that is a valid way of putting it. But I think the really important point is that the soul is not, in a sense, our completeness. And so what we're waiting for is when Jesus comes again, the souls of those who trusted in him will come to earth and be reunited with their recreated bodies. And they will be, you know, complete human beings again. So I think some of the medieval theologians talked about this, you know, the souls of those who trusted in Christ are waiting in heaven, longing for when they are reunited with their bodies and in the new creation. And so that's I think is a different understanding of soul from a lot of, say, a kind of Neoplatonic sense, or a lot of other religions where they would see the soul as being like the real me, you know, and this real me, the soul, gets trapped in a body and is just waiting to escape back into the spiritual. The Christian faith is very different from that, because actually we are embodied beings. And it's a fascinating thing. Sometimes, Stefan, you probably like this as a philosopher, you know, these philosophers do all these thought experiments about, well, if you took someone's body and put somebody else's soul in it, who would it be, you know? And if you think about that with your wife or something like that, you know, who would that be? And yeah, it actually shows, when you begin to think about it, that actually we know one another in bodies, don't we, as embodied people. And that is a, you know, that is a God-given part of our identity. So maybe in a Christian sense, you could think of a soul less as, the Greeks probably thought it as, you know, the essential part of us, and that it was a substance. And maybe in the Bible, when it describes the soul, rather than describing a substance, it's perhaps describing a sort of quality of being human, of our humanness, rather, you know, a quality of humanness, like it could be describing something like our sort of, our, yeah, perhaps being, or it's kind of, yeah, how could you put it? I don't know if you've got a better word, Stefan, but, you know, somehow that, you know, what makes us uniquely us, or something like that. Yeah, our inner being or something, but it shouldn't be separated from our bodies. It's, you know, it's integrated in the Christian worldview.
It is interesting that that's how we use the word soul, at least in English, that it's like the truest part of you.
Yeah,
like
yeah,
the grain, when the chaff of the body is beaten away, the soul can fly away to heaven.
Yeah, I think that's probably coming from this. I mean, a lot of that, you know, from these Neoplatonic ideas came back in the Enlightenment, didn't they? And the idea of yeah, the soul being the real part of us, and the body just being this vehicle. And that's not the picture we see in Genesis, where you see God creating bodies. And actually, as you know, I think, as I said in the discussion, we see that kind of soul-body dualism also present today in, say, mind-body dualism. You know, the idea with technology, we could take out our essential part, our memories, and, you know, put them in a computer, and it would somehow still be us. And, you know, I think that would be very much against the Christian worldview, you know, that if you're put in a computer, it's not you. You know, we are embodied beings.
Stefan, did you want to have any other comments on that or follow up?
I would like to have a pint with Jim. That's all I need.
Yeah.
But you had me at medieval, so thank you very much.
Thank you. We'll have to wait for the end of lockdown, Stefan, and then we can
Look forward to it.
enjoy it. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, let's see what else we got here. Sarah asked, Sarah, I don't know if you're still on, but here's your question. Will there be new stories in heaven? So Sarah says, the tension between good and evil is so essential to our stories here. What will that look like when evil is completely conquered? So Sarah's asking about, I guess there's maybe two directions you could take the question. Will we continue creating in heaven? Will we make new things? And then just that idea of conflict in stories. What will be the conflict in heaven?
Yeah, thank you. That's a very good question. And I think a lot of people think of heaven, it's part of why we maybe think of it as this boring place, because we have an idea of heaven or the new creation even as being a static place where everything is sort of made immediately perfect and just how it should be. And then you kind of say, well, you know, well, don't move because you could spoil it or make it imperfect. And what is there to do? And I think that's a wrong image of creation and of the new creation. And the reason I think that is because of, you know, because of the creation, you know, when God initially creates in Genesis, it's not a static thing. A lot of Christians see, you know, Garden of Eden as being the whole earth and just this sort of this static creation, and it's just everything's perfect and you know, there's nothing to do. But actually there's this incredible mission that God gives human beings, which is to make more of the creation, to fill it and order it and deepen it and widen it. And I discuss this in the book a little bit about how, yeah, that's really the mission that he gives human beings. And so we see the first creation isn't this static thing, it's an unfolding wonder. I think it's Al Walters, the theologian, in his book Creation Regained, he calls creation as something, is the unfolding story of the glory of God, or some phrase like that. It's this unfolding dynamic thing. And so I kind of think, well, why wouldn't the new creation be like that? Why wouldn't we continue to discover and create and invent and make, in a sense, there will be new stories, new wonders revealed, new glories. It will be this ever deepening, widening creation. And, I don't think actually you need good and evil to have a dynamic story. I think the good can be dynamic in its own right without having to have evil to be a kind of counterfoil to it. I often think of, people often talk, well, don't you need evil to know what's good? And I say, well, if you have a child who has wonderful parents, loving, kind, generous parents, they know the good and they enjoy the good, and they are blessed by the good, to live their lives and increase and live dynamic, creative lives. So I don't think we need the presence of evil to have that sense of wonder and story and of everything. C.S. Lewis says at the end of The Last Battle, it's one of my favorite bits, where he says, and now begins, the never-ending story in which each chapter is better than the one before. So I think that's what the new creation will be like. So thanks, Sarah.
Way to go, Sarah. Okay, 2 more questions, Jim. This is maybe more complicated than we have time for, but is there marriage in heaven? What would you say to that?
Yeah.
And where does that question come from?
Who does it come from, or where does it come from?
I don't remember who it comes from. But,
yeah. I mean, this is something that a lot of people think about and ask, because when Jesus is confronted by the Sadducees, who didn't believe in the resurrection of the body, a group of Jewish religious people, the Sadducees, who didn't believe in the resurrection of the body, and they set Jesus this kind of conundrum about a woman who is married to, I think, 7 different brothers that die one after the other in this life, and they say, who will she be married to in the new creation? And Jesus says, well, it will neither be marriage or giving in marriage in the new creation. And then again, the answer to this question, I think, revolves around this issue of, do we see the new creation as less than this creation and the world that we know, or more than? So maybe, what we often envisage is, well, Jesus says there won't be marriage in heaven, so we imagine less than heaven. But imagine that there is less than marriage in heaven. Imagine if there is more than marriage in heaven, that the Bible tells us, I think Paul in Ephesians tells us clearly, that marriage is a sort of signpost to something even deeper, richer, more joyful. He tells it's a signpost to the church and Jesus Christ. And so, I think perhaps in the new creation, if we imagine more than marriage, you could say something like this. I don't know if I put this well or this makes sense to you, but you could imagine marriage at its best, the commitment, the love, the intimacy, the openness, the creativity, the gift, the sharing, the blessing one another, and it becoming more and more. If you imagine something like that, but extended in a sense beyond the person you were married to in this life, you could share those things with in this life, to everybody, that kind of relationship, the depth and the beauty of that kind of relationship you have with everyone, and is shared because you are sharing in the love of Christ for his church, for his people. And yet, I would also say that, you know, some people ask them, well, won't there be anything special about the person I was married to on earth? And I say, yes, of course there is, because it's not less than the earth. The new creation is, you know, heaven coming to enrich and fulfill the earth. So you can imagine that, you know, that the depth and beauty of a marriage relationship at its best, shared with everyone, and yet not diminishing in any way the history of a relationship that you have had with someone you've been married to in this life. Okay.
Thanks, Jim. Let's do one more. Do
One
we have
more,
enough
because
time?
we're just past 10. Thanks.
Okay.
Yeah. Well, 10 our time.
This would be a
Yeah.
quick one.
Okay.
How would you explain heaven to a child?
How would you explain heaven to a child? Yeah, that is a great question. Yeah, I think Barry Seagram wrote to me recently that maybe one of his grandchildren asked him that question. He's wondering how he could explain it to a child, and there was an adult listening in, an adult in the same way. I came across a beautiful thing that I was reading in Marilyn Robinson's Gilead just last week, and it's a story about a pastor who's reaching the end of his life and has had a child late on in life and writing to this child. And I think he relates a conversation he has with another pastor about, you know, what will it be like in the new creation? And I think he says something like, think of everything you've enjoyed and loved in this world and times it by 2. And I thought, well, that's a pretty good thing you could say to a child. And then I think you could say as well, you know, think of everything that you've enjoyed that has been to do with love, you know, the love, a hug, the warmth of a kiss, you know, parents caring for you. And then imagine that times by not just 2, but by many, because you are right there with God, who is love. Then that is what the new creation will be like. So, yeah, I hope that would, yeah, give a child a longing for the new creation.
Okay, thank you, Jim. We should end here. Thank you, everyone, for coming, and
yeah,
be well. Jim, do you want
yeah,
to say
I just want to say
anything else?
thank you to everyone for coming. Thanks for all the wonderful questions. I'm sorry we didn't have time for all of them.